I have two microphones here, and I don't need two microphones. Here you go. Thank you. All right. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Great. Cool. All right. Well, welcome. It's good to see you all today. This is too low for my coffee. We're just going to hold it. So as you all know, we have been in the book of First Corinthians for the last several weeks. We're in the middle of this series called Focus that's accompanying our 5x5 Focus ministry emphasis for this year. The idea is we're trying to kind of reset, and we thought we'd start with the book of First Corinthians because it, like many of the epistles, is directed toward a church that needs a little bit of guidance, right? The fun thing about the epistles is that they are written for very specific contexts, very specific people dealing with very specific problems, which in some ways makes it seem, or it might make it seem like, okay, well, then that isn't for us, right? Like Paul didn't write it for us, and he didn't. Paul wrote it for the Corinthian church. Yes. Am I? Not wrong. Y'all, that's what I meant when I said, can you hear me? Okay, there we go. That's better.
You got a great voice.
Oh, hey, thank you. All right. So it might seem like this is not a letter for us, but I think that because Paul is writing to these very specific situations, I think gives us a window into the ways that, like Corinthians, they're just like us, or at least enough like us that we can gain some wisdom from these words of exhortation from Paul. So we're not dealing with stories, we're dealing with a letter that is trying to get people to do things, to straighten up and fly right. So in order to talk about this effectively, I think you probably need a little bit of context. And I know that Phil was with you last week and maybe gave you a little bit of this. I watched a little bit of his talk, but I didn't make it all the way through. So I apologize if any of it is repeated. All right, so Corinth is kind of an interesting city. You can see a little bit better in the top. Well, I don't know, maybe you can't because there aren't outlines, but Corinth is situated kind of in this little isthmus between the peninsula of Peloponnese and mainland Greece. Why is this important, you ask? Well, it means that it is basically the place on land that can access both of these seas. So it's a port on both sides, or it has easy access to both sides. And it makes it so that it's kind of in the way between Italy on the left. You see that little landmass over there where it says the Adriatic Sea. That's Italy. And then Greece in the middle. And then the Near East is kind of Asia Minor is over there on the right. So Corinth is it's a strategically important piece of land. So consequently, in the kind of classical age of Greece and those kind of 10th through 1st centuries BCE, Corinth was a really wealthy area, very cosmopolitan, lots of different people. There was a lot going on in Corinth. However, because of this affluence and because of the fact that Corinth was, in fact, kind of not the ruling city, but like the head city in what they call the Achaean League. That's this whole little Peloponnese area down here. All of the little city states there were in a little league together to help them economically and to help them in terms of their kind of protection of the area. Since Corinth was the head of that, Corinth was potentially a threat to Rome. So as Rome begins to build up, Corinth becomes a desirable target. And as a result, Rome completely sacks Corinth in 146 BCE. They burn it to the ground, completely destroy it. Why is this important? Well, it's important because that means that Corinth essentially has to start over and start over in a very specific way. So Rome frequently did this thing where if they sacked a city or if they just decided they wanted a city in a place strategically, they would create a colony there. And if, for example, you had burned a city to the ground and no one was living there anymore, that's fine. You have lots of people in Rome that you can just populate the city with. But who goes there? For a lot of other colonies, they would use folks who were in the military, who had kind of retired out of the military and were then guaranteed some land and security. Great, cool, we'll put you in this colony. You can have this land that we don't want. Not so in Corinth. As far as we can tell, in Corinth was really populated by some of the urban poor from the city of Rome that Rome essentially like shipped out, and then a lot of enslaved people who had been freed. So if you know anything about the Roman Empire, as they are kind of conquering various areas, they would take slaves among those people, and Rome had its fingers all over all over the near world, right? Not just in the Near East, but eventually getting all the way up to England, right? Like we're heading out in all kinds of different directions, right? So if you are taking freed people who had been enslaved, they're going to be from all over the world. And when Rome establishes this colony there, that means that Corinth is now populated by all kinds of folks. Let me move you forward a slide here. So this is a little bit of what I'm saying. Now this is a super cosmopolitan area that still has all of the same benefits in terms of trade that it did before, but a very different population than it did before. So generally we're thinking that the folks that Rome was bringing in were lower on the socioeconomic scale, but there would have been some vestiges of that kind of wealth and prestige in Corinth that remained. And of course, if you have a desirable area, there is an opportunity for upward mobility, right? So suddenly this Corinth that Paul encounters is really mixed in terms of its socioeconomic culture. There are folks up very high and down very low. And much like our society today, the difference between those who have little and those who have much is ever increasing, right? That gap is getting ever bigger. In addition, it's probably important to talk a little bit about the kind of religious landscape here. After Rome sacked Corinth and reestablished it as a colony, there would have been some pockets of kind of different religious identities. We know that there were Jewish people in the area. We have some archaeological evidence for that and some scriptural evidence for that as well. But it seems that at the time of Paul, the Roman kind of civic religion was the most prominent factor there religiously. There are examples I could give you, but I'm not sure that they would be interesting or illustrative. The one other thing to note is that while that Roman civic religion had really, really entrenched itself in New Corinth, when Paul arrived there, they seemed to be experiencing a little bit of a shift where, okay, so Rome has come in, they've reestablished Corinth as a strictly Roman area. But of course, as we discussed, there's all kinds of different people there with their own backgrounds. And then let us not forget that everybody there around is Greek, right? So during this time, about the time that Paul was there, we start to see the influence of kind of Greek traditional religion coming in as well. So there's kind of a competing religious landscape here. Now, you all know I'm a history nerd, and so you might be thinking, okay, great, do we have to listen to this all day? You do not. But I do think it's important for you to be aware of some of those things because all of those factors inform the situation into which Paul is coming. So Paul begins his mission in Corinth in about, we think it's probably about 50 CE. So right in the middle of the first century after Christ was born. And while he is there building up the church there, we think he probably spent about 5 years there in Corinth getting to know people and teaching them kind of the tenets of the Christian faith, teaching them who Jesus was and what it meant to worship. But then he left, right? He moved on, we think most likely to Ephesus. And so then the letters that we get, this kind of textual information that we have comes afterward. So we're seeing this probably coming, at the end of the 50s CE into the 60s CE later. But what did this church actually look like? I think it's really easy to think that these early churches would have looked kind of like ours. I mean, not physically, but that you'd have large assemblies of people who come together, kind of, on the level of synagogue communities. And the reality of the situation is that there might have been some of that, but the most likely scenario is that Paul, in establishing a church in Corinth, is really establishing several congregations rather than one big community. And those would have been based out of people's homes and probably would have been comprised of, I don't know, maybe half of the people in here, tops. However many people you can fit in a home to worship and celebrate communion, because that would have still been central to their worship. So knowing that the church was likely very fragmented and kind of based in people's homes, I think also informs some of the problems that Paul will address later on. As I mentioned, there's an existing Jewish population there. And so many of those Christian converts will have been Jewish people who have converted to Christianity, or people who are converting to Christianity through Judaism, because you have Jewish people who feel as if it is very important for folks to first be Jewish in order to become Christian. So that is a factor as well. It's why you heard in Phil's passage that he read last week, there's no longer Jew nor Greek, right? That we don't have that split. That's the conflict that's happening. And I think the most important thing to note is, remember, this is a wealthy area with a lot of trade, a lot of upward mobility. And as a result, we get a really commercialized society that in turn becomes very competitive and highly stratified, right? So this is, I would say, not an easy environment to exist in, right? If you're just walking into Corinth, it's not an easy way or an easy place to kind of get your grounding. It is a place where you're going to have to really scrap to succeed, because there's so much competition, not because there's lack of opportunity, but because there's so much competition. In fact, apparently there are kind of contemporary sayings that they find in literature that suggest that like, oh man, I'm going to forget exactly, but it's essentially just like, well, if you're going to Corinth, you better get ready. That it's actually really hard to make it there. I guess if you can make it in Corinth, you can make it anywhere. So let's talk about what's going on in this church then. So you have this context. And so it's, I don't know, to me, I think it kind of makes sense that the arguments that you start to see in the text of 1 Corinthians do in fact pop up, right? We see that several little disputes have started to arise. There were a lot of divisions based on class and wealth, because as we talked about, it's a really stratified society with a big gap between rich and poor, and bigger gaps between kind of all of the different stratas of society. We also know that if you kind of read through 1 Corinthians, and I'd encourage you to do that this month, if, as we're working through, if you have some time, spend a little time in 1 Corinthians, you will notice that almost all of the issues that Paul is addressing are people complaining about what other people are doing, right? It's like, it's like dealing with small children where you're like, just worry about yourself, just worry about yourself. No, this is not what the church in Corinth is doing. They are very much tattling on each other and very concerned with how other people are behaving. Not me, of course, other people. Sorry about that. And then the other thing that we notice is that because we have these small, house church situations, and because teaching is coming from different figures in the community, people are starting to kind of form allegiances to different leaders. You'll see that talk of Paul and Apollos in 1 Corinthians. That's what this is about. We have different leaders for different groups, and people start to form these allegiances. So on the whole, we're really dealing with a church that is struggling. Let me go back. Struggling with unity. It's struggling with issues of kind of just like tolerance among each other. They're really struggling to think of themselves in a way that frames their faith as something that includes and empowers others, which is what Paul envisions for them. But they're not living in a society where that is culturally like put forth, right? This is a countercultural prospect that Paul is putting forth, that you should like lift other people up with you, right? This idea of loving others and caring for them really goes against this cutthroat situation that the Corinthians are living in. So I'm actually, and yeah, sure. It's a little bit of both, right? Because we have these different house churches, there is a little bit of like, well, our church versus their church, but we see it within the communities as well. And actually, I'll just go ahead and get into it, because one of the things that's worth addressing is the specific behaviors that Paul feels like it's important to call out in this group. So we'll move on here. He addresses all of these kinds of things at various points during the text of First Corinthians. He sees people as being impatient. You'll see in chapter 11, he starts yelling at some of the folks because they are impatient to eat before the rest of the community has come together. The Lord's Supper would likely have been celebrated alongside an actual meal, right? So people are hungry, they want to eat, they're not patient to allow the rest of the group to come. Well, we're just going to eat anyway. He is not cool with that. He also sees some of these folks in Corinth as being envious. You'll see this passage from 1 Corinthians 3. He says, "For as long as there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving according to human inclinations? For when one says, I belong to Paul, and another, I belong to Apollos, are you not merely human?" Right? So this kind of envy and allegiance between different groups, that kind of competitive nature. He talks about folks within this church being boastful. Paul is really funny because sometimes he writes in this just absolutely beautiful prose, like we will read today. And sometimes he just comes right out and says it. Your boasting is not a good thing. So he's addressing their boastfulness in some areas. In addition, he has issues with them really engaging in particularly fraudulent business practices, like taking advantage of other people. When he talks about wrongdoing here, he's really alluding to them taking advantage of each other kind of in economic ways. And then he's also talking about legal disputes. So people are defrauding each other and then taking each other to court. And this is happening within their Christian communities, and he finds this reprehensible. There's actually a very long passage on this, but I'll give you the short and sweet. When any of you has a grievance against another, do you dare to take it to court before the unrighteous instead of taking it before the saints? So why are you taking this out civilly? You need to be praying and working together. In fact, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already a defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded, but you yourselves wrong and defraud, and believers at that? So that's a pretty, I don't know, I think that's a pretty damning allegation. He accuses folks of being arrogant. He says knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And then he particularly addresses another issue around communion, which is that when the churches are coming together, they draw distinctions between wealthier people and poorer people at God's table. He says, when you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper, for when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. What, do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? So they're separating themselves out and treating this Holy Communion as just another kind of Roman feast, right? Where all of the different social strata will be represented and seated appropriately. And we're just going to treat it like any other dinner. No, he says, no, this is wrong. You can't exhibit that pride, and it's rude. So knowing that all of this is going on, we get to one of the most famous passages in all of Scripture that if you've ever attended a wedding, you will know. We get there, right? All right, so this is 1 Corinthians 13. Remember, this is coming not only in addressing all these issues that we just identified, but coming directly after the passage that Phil preached on last week. So he's just gone through saying, every single one of you is important. Every single one of you has value and a purpose, be a part of the body. And then he moves into this. He says, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Oh, sorry. Or are you following me along? Thank you. I apologize. Love never ends, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end, for we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. And when I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. Bet y'all never heard that before, huh? Yeah. So it's worth diving in a little bit, right? We hear Paul calling out specifically those traits that he has identified in the church and saying, hold up, guys. No, what you're being called to, love, works against all of these things. It's probably worth noting that Paul here is using that word that you all have heard before, agape, as opposed to eros, which was the more common term for like romantic love that would have been used much more commonly in Greek writing of the time. So the use of the word agape is, for many of these folks, not a particularly familiar term. It is unique or unique enough that it requires a little bit of almost like mystical understanding. Paul knows that this is going to be a hard concept for the Corinthians to grasp. And part of the reason that it's hard for them to grasp is because Paul understands agape love as something that only God really originates, right? In fact, he really equates God with love. He kind of understands God's very nature to be this agape love. And if God is uniquely creating this love and bestowing this love, it is for the good of humanity. But if it's God's love, then like, how do we understand it, right? We have a flawed understanding of what it means to love one another, Paul assumes, right? And when I say we, I mean the Corinthian church, but we're going to insert ourselves into this a little bit too. Paul knows that this is going to be hard for them to really sink into. And that's part of why he goes into that whole extended bit at the end where he talks about when I was a child, I spoke like a child, but now I'm an adult. Or when he talks about seeing in a mirror dimly. This is all about the fact that he expects the Corinthians to really struggle with this concept, and that it is likely to be unfulfilled for them immediately, right? That this type of love, the type of love that God has for them and that God is calling them to live into, is hard enough to achieve that it's going to take time and we might not experience it in its fullness, right? That's kind of what he's getting at. He's not really trying to demean the Corinthians and call them, squabbling children. He's saying, listen, this is rough. It's something that's going to be realized in the future. And we all have to kind of move there together. Just trust me on this is kind of what he's saying. And I think he really does understand this agape love to have an inherent power to it, right? It has this kind of mystical power to transform. I will take just a moment of nerdiness to tell you that that mirror image is actually a really apt one for Corinth, because Corinth was known to have a thriving brass trade, and brass was the material out of which mirrors were made at the time. So he's trying to use these metaphors that he thinks they'll understand. It kind of makes you wonder what he would use for us today. Might still be mirrors, or it might be like selfies, phone screens. You don't have to laugh at that. It wasn't funny. Uh, okay, so Paul has these kind of ideas about love. And I think it's worth talking about why he's bringing this up for the Corinthians. He is really hoping for the Corinthian church that they can find themselves a sense of unity. It is hard for these early Christians to exist in a culture that runs counter to everything that they are trying to live out, right? And we know that it is risky in some situations to align oneself with a faith that can't uphold the expectations of Roman civic religion, right? So being a Christian in this first century, right, is not an easy proposition. The only way to make it through that is through a sense of unity and community. Paul knows that. And so he's really hoping that this Corinthian church can find some kind of strength to come together and to support each other and stop picking at each other. The fact that Second Corinthians exists, and again, take a look at that, leads us to believe that this was a much harder lift than Paul suggested, because all of these problems continue to persist. But Paul really wants them to understand that if they're going to find that unity, it's going to come through exhibiting this kind of agape love that Paul has explained to them. He thinks that this is the kind of love, as he said, that is not selfish, it's not envious, that this type of love can help them overcome their kind of natural self-interest. And he also kind of views it as the kind of animating force that allows them to act faithfully in the world. If you have the strength of this agape love, you can live in this countercultural way. And it's partially a reminder of what God has done for them, right? The agape love that God does offer to them. And it's partially a call to focus on and demonstrate that love. So Paul's like exhortation to love has these kind of multiple sides to it. He's hoping to remind the Corinthians what God has done for them and what God is calling them to do for others. And he really thinks that if they can live into this, they can fix it, right? Keeping that in mind, I think it's probably worth drawing our attention to another thing that we're going to be talking about this week, which is baptism. So, if some of y'all have friends at other churches that you observe on Facebook and whatnot, this is the time of year that we celebrate baptism of our Lord. We remember Christ's baptism in the River Jordan. Liturgically, that Sunday usually falls on the second Sunday of January. It kind of moves because the calendar changes. It depends on where Sunday and Epiphany fall. We have chosen to bump that back a Sunday for our purposes. Sorry, it's like the second time I've done that. Because first of all, we wanted third grade Bibles to stand on its own. And second, we wanted to really be able to have this moment of remembering our baptism and have that take some time and be the focus of worship this week. So this week we will be remembering our baptisms. And I think it's worth talking about how we understand baptism to function in the life of faith, because the kind of obvious connection is that it functions in very similar ways to that agape love that Paul is calling the Corinthians to remember. Baptism both enacts and ritualizes God's agape love for us. If you pay attention to the liturgy when we do baptisms, you'll notice that it tells God's story. It tells a story of humanity in terms of God's actions for us, from creation to deliverance from Egypt, all of the ways that God has utilized water to save God's people. It tells that story of salvation. It reminds us, right? But it also remembers us in another way, like it remembers. It takes all of these disparate parts of the body of Christ and calls us together. Because part of that liturgy is that it's specifically saying that we are, one body together. But if you remember, we always have a part for you all to play at the end of baptism, where it's your job to respond that you recommit yourself to raising up another person in the body of Christ, right? To be part of the body for this new member of the body. So it kind of unifies us in the body of Christ. And the other thing that you might notice is we ask all of these questions of the folks who are being baptized. We ask them about whether or not they will renounce evil, if they will fight oppression, if they will declare Jesus Christ as their savior and, promise to follow him in the church. There are all these questions. They're what we call our baptismal vows that are made either by the person being baptized or on behalf of them. And so ultimately, baptism is calling us into an active faith. It's hard for me to see those things that baptism does for us and not kind of line them up pretty directly with how Paul is visualizing agape working for the Corinthian church. And yeah, sure.
Pointed out different past week with the youth
Mm-hmm.
in the big service here Sunday night, and they did baptism. 5 were immersed, brought a tub in. Okay, 5 were actually immersed, like a real Baptist at this day. And then 9 were sprinkled, like this is we do the church. The Methodists actually, they can build it, say a lot better. I can't. We actually do immersions in the Methodist church.
Yeah, the method, yeah. The method of baptism, like how much water you get, is significantly less important to Methodists than what you are claiming in your baptism, and whether or not you were baptized in the name of the Trinity. That's kind of the important thing for us. So yeah, full immersion is absolutely acceptable in the United Methodist tradition. Really, honestly, the thing that limits us is infrastructure, right? Unless you have a baptistry, full immersion is pretty difficult. I have been at churches where we've brought in, like tubs to do that. I've been at churches that will have outdoor baptisms in kind of living water situations. All of those are totally good. What's important is that you experience the water, that you make the vows, and that you're baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity. And truthfully, the other thing that's important is that it's in the company of a community, because we understand baptism in United Methodism to be a communal act. It is that remembering of the body, right? That you are being brought into a community rather than just being like washed clean individually to go and live your life on your own. So those are the important things. Was there anything else about that, Fran, that you wanted to?
No, I just find it interesting. Methodist did immersions.
Yeah.
Just what we see primarily today.
Yeah. Yeah, with babies, and honestly, it's what we have the infrastructure for, right? It is kind of funny though, with much of much of what we do in worship has really just evolved over time based on like what works in a context, right? There's a lot of things that are like necessary, right? Or things that we view as theologically necessary. But a lot of the actual practice is really at some point, someone did a thing and they liked it. And so we kept doing it. And there's not a whole lot more rhyme and reason than that. And sometimes we then impose meaning on it afterward, after we've already established the practice. It's kind of interesting to look at. Okay, so that's agape love. That's baptism. Now I have work for you to do. In the words of Linda Richmond, discuss, I'll give you a topic. Okay, no one? SNL from like the 90s? Okay. You're talking about Johnny Carson earlier. I feel like it's fine. All right, so here are your 2 discussion questions for your table. The first one is a little bit meatier, right? It's kind of multivalent question. We read this 1 Corinthians passage that we read today very frequently at weddings, and it's great. We can all imagine what patience and kindness and the lack of arrogance looks like in a marital relationship or a one-on-one relationship But here's the thing, that is not what Paul is talking about. Paul is talking about community love, right? So what the heck is that about? How do we apply that love practically to a larger group of people? I want y'all to talk about that in your group, because I think it is honestly the question for us. What does it look like to have agape love for a whole group of people? What does it mean to hope and believe and endure for a whole group of people? And when you have a group, you obviously have competing interests too. So how does agape love help us deal with those? So again, this is a big question. You can chew on it as long as you want. If you solve all of the problems of the world and move right through it, or if that's just a stumper, I've got a second one for you, which is I would love for you to share stories about how your love has helped you to do a difficult or uncomfortable thing. Think about something you've done for a person that you love, or for the country that you love. There are all kinds of ways that love helps us to do difficult or uncomfortable things. So discuss.